Have you ever felt something like this? Stay with me until the end and share your thoughts. The marble floor of the Sterling Tower, a palace of polished stone and cold glass, shimmered under the sweeping arc of a janitor's worn mop. The silence of the 45th floor, normally a battleground of high finance, was absolute, broken only by the wet shush of the synthetic fibers and the distant tick-tick-tick of a cheap metallic wristwatch strapped to a hand that knew only hard work. This was John, Miller's world now, a landscape of forgotten power, where the shush of his mop was the only voice in the graveyard shift, and the faint scent of sterile cleaner was a mask for the profound, silent emptiness that had haunted him for years. The hand itself, calloused and thick, moved with a familiar, weary efficiency, a stark contrast to the sheer, unbridled luxury of the executive penthouse where fortunes were made and sometimes lost. John paused, his eyes lifting, catching his reflection in the floor, a man defined by the faded blue of his work uniform, a ghost in a kingdom he served but never belonged to. For years he had carried the weight of a secret, a failure that had stripped him of his former life, a life of expertise, of saving lives, and of influence, trading it for the anonymity of the night shift and a meager wage. His real burden, however, was not the mopping, but the constant gnawing fear of disappointing his daughter, the reason he had taken this invisible role, and the single remaining anchor to his fractured world. The shame was a relentless, silent echo, heard only in the quiet ticks of that cheap watch, a constant reminder of the expertise he no longer dared to use, a promise broken to himself. But tonight, the silence held something new, a stillness far too deep for the empty hours of the financial elite's domain. As John rounded the corner of the executive corridor, the air grew suddenly thick, the faint aroma of expensive perfume mixing with something metallic and wrong. He found the door to CEO Victoria Sterling's private office ajar, a sliver of deep shadow spilling onto the pristine carpet. Victoria Sterling, the woman whose face graced every business magazine, the undisputed financial titan of New York, was not supposed to be here at this hour. She was meant to be a myth, a signature on a paycheck, not a physical presence. The image that hit him was a violent, shocking break from his routine. Victoria Sterling, impeccably, dressed but tragically pale, lay slumped against her mahogany desk, a figure of profound power reduced to sudden, terrifying vulnerability. A crystal water glass lay shattered nearby, glittering like scattered diamonds on the carpet, catching the faint, cold moonlight that streamed through the panoramic windows. The scene screamed of something more than exhaustion. It was an immediate, visceral conflict that snapped John out of his practiced anonymity. His mop clattered against the marble floor, the sound impossibly loud, and for a fleeting, terrifying second the janitor vanished, replaced by the instinct of the man he once was, the man who knew the language of crisis and the precise steps to avert a final, fatal collapse. John's training, buried deep beneath years of routine and denial, surged back with a cold, focused clarity that superseded his janitor's uniform. He didn't hesitate. He moved with the swift, precise economy of a professional, his gaze instantly assessing the shallow, ragged breaths and the alarming pallor of Victoria's skin. Forgetting the massive liability, forgetting the cameras and the certain firing that would follow, he gently shifted her body into a safer position, his large, rough hands working with a forgotten tenderness on the delicate structure of a woman who was, for all intents and purposes, a queen. The contrast between his worn-out life and her dying luxury was sharp, yet in this moment of pure crisis, the class barrier dissolved. Only two human beings remained, one fighting to hold on to life, the other instinctively fighting to preserve it. He quickly checked for a pulse, weak, thready, almost impossible to find, and then began a series of small, calculated actions, stabilizing her, drawing on the knowledge he had vowed never to use again, the painful expertise from a past that was supposed to be dead. He located an emergency medical kit, discreetly tucked away in a panel beside her desk, a small confirmation that Victoria, the empire builder, was always prepared, even for her own collapse. John worked silently, with the swift, economical grace of a man who understood the geometry of the human body and the fragile thread of life, administering what he could. To stabilize the immediate crisis, his mind racing through protocols he hadn't touched in a decade. As the immediate danger subsided, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor ran through Victoria's body, and her eyelids flickered open. Her eyes, usually sharp and penetrating, were clouded with pain and a shocking, unexpected awareness. She didn't see the janitor hovering over her. She saw a face of competence and deep, unsettling familiarity. Their eyes locked for a fraction of a second, an intimate and terrifying acknowledgement across the chasm of their different worlds. It was a moment stripped bare of titles and wealth, just the raw, silent understanding of a life hanging in the balance, a connection that defied logic, and one that demanded a response beyond a mere thank you. Victoria's lips parted, and a soundless message seemed to pass between them, a desperate plea that had nothing to do with calling an ambulance. Her hand, trembling but determined, moved slowly, deliberately, searching for something in the inner pocket of her designer jacket. It was not a gesture of gratitude or fear, but one of urgent, calculated intent. The act itself was laborious, consuming her remaining strength, a silent testament to a secret far more pressing than her own health. John held his breath, watching the deliberate movement, sensing the profound risk she was taking, the immediate danger of this sudden, terrible vulnerability. With a monumental effort, her fingers emerged, clutching a small, tightly folded piece of heavy stock paper, the kind used for the most important, confidential correspondence. Her gaze was fierce now, burning with a mix of despair and a cold, protective resolve, communicating volumes in the absolute silence of the opulent office. She leaned in, her voice a rough, almost inaudible rasp, barely escaping her lips, closer to a breath than a word, her fragile proximity demanding absolute secrecy and silence, the final, desperate instruction of a woman running out of time and trust. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the office door, a silent, pointed warning that sent a chill down John's spine, before they settled back on him with an agonizing intensity, the urgency undeniable. Her hand shot forward, pressing the folded note deep into the center of his palm, closing his fingers around it with a surprising, desperate strength, a final physical transference of a lethal secret. With that last ounce of desperate power, Victoria Sterling whispered one single piercing word into the silence, her eyes already starting to glaze over again, sinking back into the profound darkness of unconsciousness. Go. The single guttural word, go, hung in the chilled air, echoing in John's mind with the sharp finality of a command, a stark and immediate counterpoint to the life-saving protocols that still pulsed through his veins. He stood frozen, his palm stinging from the impression of the folded note, his inner conflict a sudden, violent tempest. His rational mind, the mind of the anonymous night janitor, screamed at him to drop the paper, to call 911 immediately, to wipe his prints and vanish back, into the shadows and the anonymity that was his only safety. This note, this unexpected and intimate secret thrust upon him by the richest woman in the city, felt less like a gift and more like a ticking bomb, a direct threat to the fragile, quiet life he had meticulously built around his daughter. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany door of the office burst open, shattering the tense silence, and two figures rushed in. The head of security, an imposing man named Harrison, with eyes like chipped ice, and the company's chief operating officer, a polished man named Andrew Davies, whose expensive suit seemed to wrinkle instantly with alarm. John instinctively, swiftly, and silently balled his hand around the note, tucking it deep into the pocket of his worn uniform, the crinkle of the paper a terrifying sound against the deafening rush of adrenaline. Harrison's gaze fixed on John, his expression one of immediate, intense suspicion, his eyes scanning the scene, cataloguing the janitor's proximity to the fallen CEO, the dropped mop, and the shattered glass. "What the hell happened, Miller?" Harrison's voice was a low, dangerous rumble, laced with accusation, his body language communicating an instantaneous, profound distrust. John met the intense gaze, relying on the practiced blankness of his blue-collar persona, the easy, invisible mask he wore to navigate this privileged world. "I heard the crash, sir." "The glass," John responded, his voice steady, his gaze deliberately flat and unassuming, an art he had perfected over the years. But inside, a frantic voice screamed a warning. "Get out now, this is not your fight. You have a daughter to protect." The arrival of the security chief was a cold splash of reality, forcing John back into the skin of the invisible man, the one who only cleaned and was never seen or heard. Yet, The pressure of the note in his pocket was a physical presence, a warm weight refusing to be ignored, and with it came a ghostly echo from his past. The voice of his late wife, soft yet firm, reciting a phrase that used to be their shared family motto, "The silent oath is the hardest to break, John. Choose wisely." The memory was sharp, a painful jab of conscience, stirring the old noble impulses he had buried under the shame of his present circumstances and the burden of his failure. He retreated to the edges of the room, collecting his discarded mop and bucket, the familiar tools a sudden, unwelcome shield. Davies, the COO, spoke into a phone, with urgent, hushed tones, while Harrison remained fixed on John, his eyes following the janitor's every slow movement, a silent, predatory assessment. It was clear that John was not seen as a rescuer, but as a liability, an anomaly in the high-stakes drama, a low-status witness who must be catalogued and neutralized. The unfairness of the scrutiny was a familiar, bitter taste, but it was the look in Victoria's eyes, that moment of profound, wordless trust, that now tugged at the frayed edges of his rational resistance. John stepped back into the corridor, the polished marble floor now reflecting not just his own image, but the looming shadow of the security chief, who watched him leave with an unnerving, palpable intensity. He walked away from the sterile opulence, the adrenaline beginning to subside, leaving a churning mix of fear and moral obligation. He could have tossed the note into the nearest waste bin, erasing the incident entirely, preserving his perfect, necessary invisibility. But his hand remained tightly closed around the paper, the rough edges of the fold digging into his skin, a small, persistent pain that was instantly and powerfully amplified by the sudden, overwhelming scent of antiseptic on his hands, the residual smell of the emergency kit that triggered another memory, the sterile, cold smell of the operating room he had walked away from. The scent was a ghost of his past life as a highly skilled, compassionate trauma surgeon. The secret reason for his shame and his flight to anonymity. He had left the profession after a catastrophic loss, a patient he couldn't save, a burden of guilt too heavy to carry. Now the antiseptic smell, coupled with Victoria's desperate trust, was an immediate, powerful confrontation with the man he had been and the coward he had become. The note was not just paper, it was a desperate appeal, and ignoring it would be betraying not just Victoria, but the core moral code that he had tried so hard to bury. He knew with a sinking feeling of inevitability that he couldn't just go. He had to understand where she wanted him to go. John found a quiet, dimly lit corner in the tower's sub-level parking garage, a fortress of cold concrete and humming fluorescent lights, far from the watchful eyes of Harrison. His heart was still hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs as he finally, cautiously, unfolded the note. The paper, stiff and formal, held only 5 spidery, determined words, written in a hasty but elegant script that spoke of immense education and absolute authority. Safe 45C, the old clock. No signature, no explanation. Just a coded directive that immediately deepened the mystery and heightened the terror. The reference to the old clock was the first narrative clue that transcended the simple urgency of the note, hinting at something deeply personal, hidden within the sterile world of high finance and corporate intrigue. The fear for his own precarious life, however, was quickly overshadowed by a new, more immediate worry. The urgent, quiet beep of his phone, displaying a text message from his daughter's school. "John, call me urgently. Regarding the payment for the field trip, we need to discuss this immediately." The message was a cold, sharp reminder of the financial tightrope he walked every day, the very reason for his invisibility and his unwavering need for the janitorial salary. The risk of losing this job, of being exposed, suddenly became a tangible threat to his daughter's security, raising the stakes exponentially. He was now juggling a high-stakes corporate conspiracy with the mundane, soul-crushing reality of unpaid school fees. Using his maintenance keycard, John slipped back into the deserted 45th floor. His objective was the CEO's private, soundproofed vault, designated 45C, which he knew was cleverly disguised behind a large framed abstract painting in the reception area. The very act of touching the painting, of slipping his fingers around the gilded edge to trigger the concealed lock mechanism, was a profound trespass into a realm where he was forbidden to exist. As the heavy steel door of the safe swung silently inward, The sudden low-frequency hum of a hidden surveillance camera turning towards him sent a sickening lurch through his gut, a realization that Harrison was not merely suspicious, but actively monitoring him. Inside the safe, nestled among stacks of confidential documents and rare stock certificates, John found the old clock, a beautifully crafted antique timepiece, completely out of place in the modern vault, its brass casing polished and deeply personal. It wasn't just a beautiful object, it was a distraction, and tucked beneath its heavy pedestal, he found the real prize, a generic-looking USB flash drive, small, unremarkable, and obviously the key Victoria intended for him to retrieve. The urgency that had compelled Victoria to use her dying breath to send him here was now perfectly clear. She hadn't needed a doctor. She had needed an executor, someone completely outside the circle of suspicion, someone truly invisible. John quickly copied the contents of the flash drive onto his phone, a task he was able to perform quickly due to his years of advanced technical training from his past life, a skill that felt strangely empowering after years of scrubbing floors. The file was a single high-resolution video, and the title alone was a hammer blow. In case of untimely absence. He retreated to the stairwell, the raw concrete an echo chamber for his mounting anxiety, and played the video, the low-resolution image of Victoria Sterling, looking remarkably calm and prepared, filling the screen of his cheap phone. Her voice, though slightly husky, was firm, a testament to her ruthless foresight. The video was a confession and a precise accusation, a meticulously planned narrative of her own potential demise. Victoria detailed, with chilling precision, the systematic sabotage of the company's stocks by her own COO, Andrew Davies, the very man who had rushed into the office earlier, playing the part of the concerned colleague. Davies, she explained, was planning a hostile takeover, deliberately poisoning her with small, untraceable doses over time, intending to create a sudden, natural collapse that would allow him to seize control and dismantle her philanthropic legacy, replacing it with sheer, unbridled profit. Her eyes in the video, however, held a peculiar, tender sadness as she shifted the focus from the corporate conspiracy to John himself. "John Miller," she spoke, her voice suddenly soft, almost apologetic. "I chose you not because you are invisible, but because of what you chose to lose to protect the only thing that mattered." She then directed the camera to a framed, faded black and white photograph on her desk. A picture of a much younger man, a doctor, leaning over a hospital bed, his face blurred by the distance, but his gesture of compassion unmistakable. The image was a profound, silent accusation, a secret from John's past, his past life as a surgeon now exposed. The cliffhanger landed. Victoria didn't just expose Davies, she exposed John, revealing that she knew his secret, the reason he left medicine, his guilt, and his identity. Her final words on the video were a plea and an order. "Davies is coming. You have 24 hours to use this proof to stop him. Do it for the girl, John. Don't repeat your father's mistake." The reference to his father, a man John revered but barely knew, struck him with the force of a physical blow, adding a layer of deep, personal historical trauma to the immediate danger. The final frame of the video showed a second, older photograph tucked behind the modern one, a picture of a young Victoria years ago shaking hands with a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to John. The man was John's father, a connection that now felt less like coincidence and more like a profound, cyclical return of fate. John's mind raced. His father had worked for the Sterling family decades ago, an act of charity his mother had often alluded to but never fully explained. The stakes were now unbearably personal. Victoria wasn't a stranger. She was connected to his history and his familial legacy of sacrifice and silent, unnoticed work. The pressure intensified further when John received a cryptic, threatening email on his work account, a quick, untraceable message that read only, "Don't you think I know about the clock, Miller? I know about your father's debt. Leave the key where you found it, or your little girl pays the price." The message, clearly from Davies, confirmed the worst. He was not only being watched, but his daughter was now explicitly targeted. The urgency to act, to transform from the janitor into the protector, became a visceral, suffocating need, a violent demand for justice that transcended mere financial concern. John realized he couldn't go to the police. They would see a blue-collar janitor with a flimsy flash drive and a conspiracy theory. easily dismissed by the powerful COO Davies. He had to use the one weapon Davies didn't expect, the deep invisible connections of the Sterling network that Victoria had secretly controlled. He had to find a way to get the video to the only person who could act on it immediately, the elderly chairman of the board, who was holding an emergency charity gala that very night, a bastion of old-school financial morality whom Davies had, in his arrogance, completely underestimated and ignored. The journey to the gala was a descent into the city's opulent underbelly, a world of black ties and shimmering gowns, a universe away from his cleaning supplies and time clock. John, still in his worn uniform, used the maintenance tunnels and service elevators, the architecture of the building serving as both his hiding place and his secret path to the elite. As he ascended, the scent of expensive perfume and aged scotch wafted down the service shaft, a powerful, intoxicating contrast to the sterile cleaners and stale air of the janitor's closet. He was climbing from invisibility to absolute exposure, a choice driven not by revenge, but by the immediate threat to his daughter, a risk that outweighed any fear of personal ruin. Finally, he reached the grand ballroom, the sound of classical music and polite high society laughter, a cruel, distant mockery of his tension. He stood just outside the service door, watching the chairman of the board, a frail but formidable man, surrounded by a court of powerful figures. John knew he had mere seconds to cross the threshold, present the evidence and retreat before Davies' security. Harrison, who was stationed at the main entrance, spotted him. This was the point of no return. The janitor was about to step into the light, and the consequences would either save the Empire and his daughter or condemn him to certain absolute ruin. John pushed through the service door, the sudden blast of opulent light and sound a physical shock that momentarily disoriented him, the worn soles of his maintenance boots squeaking a terrible, loud dissonance on the highly polished ballroom floor. He moved with a focused desperation, cutting a path through the stunned and silent crowd of tuxedoed financiers and elegantly gowned socialites, a figure of profound blue-collar intrusion in a sanctuary of white-collar wealth. Harrison, the head of security, instantly spotted him from across the room, his eyes narrowing to murderous slits, his body language signaling an immediate, aggressive intercept that John knew he could not outrun. He had mere moments before the confrontation would turn violent, and the evidence would be lost forever. He reached the chairman's side just as Harrison lunged, his large hand reaching for John's collar. "Sir, you need to see this now." John's voice was a rough, urgent rasp, cutting through the refined chatter and the smooth strains of the string quartet. He ignored Harrison's grasping hand, thrusting his phone, the video already playing, into the startled chairman's view. The music of the string quartet faltered, the room hushed to a horrified silence as the powerful, calm image of Victoria Sterling's face, speaking of betrayal and death, filled the screen of the janitor's battered phone. The effect was immediate, the collective, frozen shock of the elite, a silent, powerful acknowledgement of the hidden truths exposed. Andrew Davies, the COO, who had been making a show of polite conversation nearby, saw the video and the chairman's ashen face, and the mask of concern instantly evaporated, revealing a raw, naked panic. He let out a sharp, choked sound, a gesture of absolute total defeat. Harrison, seeing the proof, the undeniable image of his boss's confession playing openly, hesitated, his aggressive posture collapsing into confusion, the line between loyalty and legality suddenly blurred and terrifyingly clear. The air thickened with the profound weight of the revelation. The invisible janitor, covered in the residual dust of his unseen labor, had just delivered the truth that brought an empire to its knees. The room dissolved into a controlled but undeniable chaos, whispers, gasps, and the furious, decisive action of the chairman, who, despite his age and frailty, possessed an iron will. He calmly took John's phone, nodded once, a gesture of profound, wordless trust and acknowledgement, and signaled for the police who were conveniently stationed at the charity event. John, having delivered the message, the heavy burden of the secret suddenly lifted, felt a dizzying emptiness, the adrenaline finally giving way to bone-deep exhaustion. He watched as Davies was quietly, efficiently escorted away, his expensive suit and polished demeanor doing nothing to mask the total ruin of his ambition. John stood there, completely exposed, his uniform a sudden beacon of the ordinary amid the extraordinary, utterly vulnerable but profoundly at peace. He had faced his fear, not of a powerful corporation, but of his own failure. He had honored the silent oath and protected his daughter. It was in this moment of absolute, exhausted silence, as the ballroom began to buzz with hushed conversations, and the string quartet tentatively started to play again, that the weight of his past finally felt manageable. He was no longer the coward running from his failure. He was the man who chose to save a life twice, and in doing so finally saved himself. The chairman, after handing the phone to the officers, walked back to John, ignoring the hundreds of curious eyes. He didn't offer a handshake or a reward, but merely met John's eyes with a look of deep, knowing understanding, the silent, mutual recognition of two men who had just saved something far more valuable than a company's stock price. The chairman's simple, solemn gaze was the true payoff. A silent acknowledgement that John was more than the man who mopped floors. He was a man of profound courage and silent, undeniable nobility. Days later, John was summoned to the now-recovered Victoria Sterling's immense executive office, the same room where he had found her near death, now gleaming with renewed cold authority. He stood awkwardly at the center of the plush carpet, the room smelling of fresh flowers and a strange, quiet gratitude. Victoria, seated behind the mahogany desk, was impeccably poised, her eyes sharp and clear, yet holding a lingering softness that hadn't been there before the crisis. She didn't offer him a grand speech or a check, avoiding the expected transactional gesture of a wealthy benefactor. Instead, her gaze fell upon a small, worn metallic object she had placed carefully on the polished surface of her desk, right in the center of the vast wood expanse. It was John's cheap old wristwatch, the one he had lost during the chaos of the rescue in the office, the physical motif of his struggle and invisibility. The metallic strap was still slightly scuffed, the glass face scratched, a silent, humble testament to years of hard labor and the relentless march of time. Victoria gently pushed the watch across the desk toward him, her gesture deliberate and meaningful. "Your father," she began, her voice low and steady. "He was the one who quietly funded my first scholarship, an invisible debt, repaid in an invisible act of courage. He taught me the true value of quiet work." It was the final, profound revelation, confirming the generational connection and John's inherited nobility. John picked up the watch, his calloused fingers closing around the cold metal, feeling the familiar weight that now felt profoundly different. It wasn't a symbol of shame or failure anymore, but a silent medal of honor, a recognition of his true worth. The transformation was completed not with words, but with an act of acknowledgement that honored the man who had lost his identity to protect his child. Victoria didn't offer him money, but instead offered a new beginning, a position as director of corporate security, allowing him to use his former strategic skills and provide an immediate, secure future for his daughter, along with a full guaranteed scholarship fund for her education. The scene faded to the Sterling Tower lobby, bathed in the soft, warm light of the afternoon sun, a stark visual contrast to the cold, lonely shadows of John's night shift. John was no longer in the blue uniform. He was dressed in a sharp, well-fitting suit, walking out with a confidence that had been absent for years. His daughter was beside him, her small hand tightly holding his, her eyes wide with pride and admiration. He stopped, not at the service entrance, but at the main, grand glass doors, and looked down at his daughter. He bent, and their embrace was a silent, powerful catharsis, the redemption of a man who had finally been seen. His look, calm and centered, was the final payoff. The man who mopped floors had saved a life, a legacy, and most importantly, had finally found his way back home to himself. If this story moved you, reminding you that true wealth isn't measured in titles, don't forget to like and share it with someone who needs hope.